The Schmitz and Bush families. Let's start here. Remember Mary Kay Letourneau? You know, the woman that got pregnant after raping her 13-year-old student? Yeah, child rape. She's the sister of Joseph E. Schmitz, who was a conservative lawyer and former Inspector General of the Department of Defense, and he's now an executive with Blackwater, who he refused to investigate and helped cover up a massive scandal there involving Boeing and all these guys. I'll explain that later. Their brother is John P. Schmitz. He was the former White House counsel until he was replaced by Fred Felding, who is George Bush's personal lawyer and now a lawyer for Blackwater. Fred Felding is actually countersuing the families of the 4 Blackwater employees who were found strung up on a bridge in Fallujah. The families wanted to know the circumstances surrounding that event, and Blackwater didn't like that too much, and so they're actually countersuing the families with Fred Felding and 5 other firms. This asshole was also on the 9/11 Commission. Yeah, no bias there. Bush's lawyer on the 9/11 Commission. John P. Schmitz was also involved with Iran-Contra back when he was an aide for Bush the First, Bush Sr., and he refused to testify to the Waltz Commission. Of course, Iran-Contra also involved Mark Rich, who I'm going to talk about later, and Lee Hamilton, who was also on the 9/11 Commission. He gave a room full of criminals immunity during Iran-Contra. Then George Bush Sr. pardoned another 6, and then Clinton pardoned some more, including Mr. Mark Roach, who we'll get to in a bit. So we have a rapist, 2 actually, a baby rapist and a child rapist, an inspector general who is the executive of a secretive mercenary group, and the former White House counsel who was replaced by a Blackwater lawyer who just so happened to also be on the 9/11 Commission and is George Bush's personal lawyer as well. Schmitz's father, John G. Schmitz, was a senator and congressman from California. Pretty famous for his right-wing stances, occasional racist and homophobic remarks. His public career was ended when it was revealed they had an affair and fathered 2 illegitimate children. He got in trouble after his 13-month-old son of his mistress was found with hair wrapped around his penis. I think that explains why his other legitimate children are so messed up. Just to get in the guy's head, he bought a house of his hero, Joseph McCarthy, who I'll call a modern version of a witch trial-like fear mentality of the insanely religious psychopath. Schmitz's wife's sister is Columba Bush, who's married to Jeb Bush, George Bush Jr.'s brother, one of his brothers. So John P. Schmidt and Jeb Bush are brother-in-laws. Schmidt also worked for the neocon James Buckley, as did his brother, former Inspector General, and cover-up for Blackwater, who's now an executive for them. Jeb Bush, of course, is known to fly around on planes with drug dealers, and his brother Neil, of course, was caught with hookers and had investments, aka payoff, in the Ignite software from Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky. Wonderful. His other brother Marvin, who was the head of security for the World Trade Centers until September 10th, 2001, had a pretty strange suicide of his babysitter who was run over by her own car. This is another one of those many unsolved murders. And then, of course, there's GW's been caught with cocaine and has gotten DUIs, etc. He's a drug addict as well. When Neil Bush got caught in Southeast Asia with hookers, he said they just showed up at his door and wanted to have sex, but they didn't ask for money. Someone else paid the hookers for him in exchange for his financial dealings. GW comes from an extremely messed up family. You can tell that his brain's been eaten up by cocaine. Just listen to him say any of his speeches. He's a pure addict. Anyway, okay, so these children, Jeb and Marvin and Neil, they come from George Bush Sr., of course, former director of the CIA, the largest terrorist organization in the world. These yellow boxes just mean a lot. I can't even start writing the flow chart for Boris Berezovsky or the CIA because there's too many things the oligarchs and the CIA are involved in. George Bush Sr., now a spokesman for the private equity firm the Carlyle Group, was at a meeting with Osama bin Laden's brother on the morning of September 11th. Ironically, his son Neil was set to have dinner with Scott Hinckley, the brother of John Hinckley, who almost made George Bush Sr. president. Came inches away from that. George Bush's brother, Prescott Jr., was involved with the Inagawa Kai. It's the third largest Yakuza group in Japan. I'll explain that later. And that, again, they're involved with too much stuff. Really evil bastards. And then their father, Prescott Sr., of course, was the principal financier for the Nazis. So you have the largest, nastiest criminal group from Germany, Japan, the United States, and Russia. And they're all involved with Bushes of different generations. Amazing family. Of course, W, not to be outdone by Clinton, whose spiritual advisor was giving him advice on adultery while standing next to his pregnant mistress. George Bush's spiritual advisor was Ted Haggard, who got caught with a male hooker as well as doing crank. It's just a plethora of sexual scandals and drugs. Of course, Bush's vice president, Dick Cheney, was on the D.C. Madame list. She had a very bizarre suicide. Also on that list was Vitter and several other people in government. Cheney's chief of staff, Louis Libby, P.N.A.C. Arthur with him, was on the White House Iraq group with Rove. He was a plane leaker. Leaked on Valerie plane, so did Rove. He wrote a book about underage Japanese girls getting raped by animals. Rove, of course, had a male hooker in the White House, Jeff Gannon. And Jeff Gannon made references to internal government memos about the plane affair before it was public. So why did this male hooker have such access to the highest levels of the White House? We're starting to learn a little bit about Karl Rove's closet. So he actually was a male hooker and part of a fake news organization. All this blue is sex scandals and drugs on the map. The yellow are businesses and the white is people. Libby, of course, was a lawyer for the Mossad agent Mark Rich, who also has ties to the oligarchs. Mark Rich, of course, is in bed with the Clintons. Bill Clinton gave him a pardon on his last day in office. Rich, of course, was involved in the Iran-Contra affair as well with Lee Hamilton, who was on the 9/11 Commission, as was fellow PNAC member John Lehman on the 9/11 Commission, part of PNAC, as was Libby and Cheney. 9/11 Commission also had James Thompson III, who was on the board of directors of Hollinger with Kissinger and Pearl. Of course, of Trireme Boeing. I'm going to go over this scandal now. Now here's what went down. Now Schmitz had already covered for Richard Pearl for his Global Crossing scam, which I don't have time to get into, but the big one was in May 2003, and this involved Boeing and Trireme, Richard Pearl, and all the usual suspects. Okay, so Boeing invests $20 million in Richard Pearl and Henry Kissinger's private equity firm, Trireme. Then, they suddenly get a contract for 100 tanker planes worth $30 billion. Totally unnecessary. Didn't need these planes, by the way. Pearl writes editorial in the Wall Street Journal promoting what's essentially his own deal with Boeing. And then the weapons buyer for the Pentagon, Pete Aldrich Jr., approves of the deal on his last day in office. Senator John Warner of Virginia, he was the head of the Armed Services Committee, called it the most significant defense procurement mismanagement in contemporary history. A couple of low-level schmucks ended up in jail. The Secretary of the Air Force resigned, and ultimately it was up to Joseph Schmidt to investigate. So Schmidt comes out with a report censoring all connections to any White House officials, and he even submitted it to the White House for review before he released it. It's like giving the criminals the paper and saying, will this be okay? Is this good enough? I made sure none of you get in trouble. Schmidt also refused to investigate a case about human trafficking when KBR, that's Kellogg Brown and Root of Halliburton, had 35,000 third world nationals working for them in horrible conditions. This is a company that's since been caught in alleged rape of its own employees, drugging female employees who were in Iraq and gang raping them. What a bunch.